Hello, welcome back, everybody. Sorry, there was a bit of a miscommunication and this longer break was announced. We're starting this session at 11:30. And the chairperson is Dr. Ned Snelling, whom I would like to introduce. So, Ned, over to you.
Thank you, Prof. Barney. Well, in this session, we have 5 very talented postgraduate students presenting their research. We're going to start off with Tembeka Ntetwa, and she's going to be talking to us about the most reliable sites for pulse oximetry in anaesthetized white rhinoceros. Then Chad Berman will be next, and he's talking to us about cholesterol levels as well as other high energy macromolecules in the blood of cats fed different diets, high protein versus high carb diets. And then Claire Apongo will be the third speaker, and she's talking to us about the prevalence of the viral disease PPR among sheep and goats in a rural setting in Uganda. Then the fourth speaker, Refiwe Bakoba, she is going to be telling us about the prevalence of Toxoplasma gondii among humans, as well as among domesticated and wildlife species in Mpumalanga. And then our last speaker, Chantal Khailen, will be talking to us about the contrasting anesthesia regimes in chimps and its effect on the cardiovascular functionality, as well as various blood parameters. So if there are any questions, please feel free to make use of the Q&A, and I will get to those once the 5 speakers have finished talking to us. So without further ado, it gives me pleasure to welcome Tembeka Ntetwa to talk to us about the Rhino studies that she's been doing.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to present my work, which is part of my PhD project. As we are all aware, poaching is having a massive impact on the rhinoceros. And over the past few years, the rhinoceros population has reduced by 59%. Chemical immobilization is an important tool that helps with different management and conservation procedures to help save rhino. However, rhinoceros are more susceptible to the side effects caused by these immobilization drugs, and these side effects therefore pose a high risk to the animal. Immobilization drugs such as ditofin that are used to immobilize white rhinoceros cause hypoxemia by slowing down breathing, which decreases ventilation, by altering gas exchange, and also increasing muscle rigidity and metabolism. It has also been shown that lateral and dorsal recumbency also worsens hypoxemia by compressing the diaphragm, leading to difficulty in breathing. If hypoxemia is left untreated, it can lead to tissue hypoxia, organ failure, and death. And in most cases during chemical immobilization, hypoxemia is either left untreated or misdiagnosed. And that's why it's important for us to find accurate, reliable, and field-ready techniques that can monitor blood oxygenation during chemical immobilization. It is also important for us to note that hypoxemia begins when arterial oxygen hemoglobin saturation is below 95%. Below 80%, that's when the animal starts getting severe hypoxemia, and that's when things get very dangerous for the animal. Techniques that are used to assess blood oxygenation include pulse oximetry. I'm sure everyone is quite aware of pulse oximetry. However, its use is still not known, particularly in rhinoceros. That's why it's important for us to better assess it. Core oximetry is used to better assess these different devices because it's the most accurate way of measuring oxygen saturation in arterial blood. But even though core oximetry is accurate, it is very invasive because it requires arterial samples to be collected. It is expensive, and it also does not give continuous readings. On the other hand, pulse oximetry is cheap, and easy to use, and also non-invasive. It also gives us continuous readings. However, nothing is known about its accuracy and also its limitations, particularly in white rhinoceros. The accuracy of pulse oximetry is well documented in domestic animals. Only one study was done on white rhinoceros, but this study was very theoretical and it relied on algorithms to compare with pulse oximetry readings. And this study only looked at one attachment site, which was the ear. And reliability of pulse oximetry highly depends on where the probes are placed. For example, in sheep, llamas, and alpacas, the tongue is the most reliable site. In cattle and impala, the tail seems to be the most reliable, whereas in horses and monkeys, the cheek is the most reliable. So apart from the study that was done in impala, no other study looked at the reliability of pulse oximetry at different attachment sites in wildlife. Therefore, the aim of the study was to establish in immobilized white rhinoceros whether pulse oximetry is a reliable method to monitor blood oxygenation. And if so, which of the attachment site gives the most reliable SpO2 measure? So, this study was done on 6 immobilized white rhinoceros. The white rhinoceros were immobilized with the torfin, and once they were safe to approach, pulse oximetry probes were placed at different attachment sites for data collection. And at 30 and 40 minutes, the animals were given butorphanol and oxygen to increase their blood oxygen levels before reversing the immobilization at 60 minutes. We specifically used the 2500A Nonin palm-set pulse oximetries and the 2000T transflectance probe that were cleaned with alcohol and then placed at different attachment sites. The first probe was inserted in the space between the third eyelid and the sclera after putting pressure on the orbit and making sure that the LED and the photodiode of the probe were facing the third eyelid. Whereas the other probe was placed in a modified barbecue tongue. And then this tongue and the probe were then inserted into the mouth against the mucosa of the cheek, making sure that the LED and the photodiode of the probe were facing the mucosa. Another probe was inserted into the rectum against the rectal mucosa, and the probe was next to a temperature probe that was used to measure rectal temperature. Lastly, a probe was placed under the tail, at the base of the tail, against a non-pigmented part of the skin. Once all the probes were securely placed, arterial blood samples were then collected at 5 minute intervals, and pulse oximetry readings were taken within a minute of collecting arterial blood samples. The arterial blood samples were then analyzed using a core oximetry, which was used as our reference method. Then the oxygen saturation values from the core oximeter were then compared with the oxygen saturation from the pulse oximeter. In cases where we compare different devices, the data can sometimes be accurate and not precise. Precise but not accurate. So we want our data to be accurate and precise to consider pulse oximetry a reliable way of measuring blood oxygenation. We therefore analyze our data using a Blount-Altman analysis that measures the bias, which is the measure of accuracy, and precision, which is the measure of random error. We then measure the area root mean squared, which combines both the bias and the precision to measure reliability. So our target values for reliability of pulse oximetry is a bias of less than or equals to 3%, a precision of less than or equals to 3%, and the area root mean squared of less than or equals to 4%. Our results show that when the probe were inserted into the rectum, our pulse oximetry readings were accurate at the oxygen saturation range of 90 to 100, but were imprecise, so overall reliability was poor at this attachment site. At the other ranges, pulse oximetry was both inaccurate and imprecise. When the probe was placed under the tail, pulse oximetry readings were precise at the saturation ranges of 80 to 89 and 90 to 100%, but they were inaccurate Therefore, overall reliability was poor at this attachment site. At the other ranges, pulse oximetry was both inaccurate and imprecise. With the probe against the mucosa of the cheek, we found that pulse oximetry readings were accurate at the oxygen saturation ranges of 70 to 100% and 80 to 89%. However, the data was imprecise, so the overall reliability was poor at this attachment site. At the other ranges, pulse oximetry was both inaccurate and imprecise. When the probe was placed under the third eyelid, we found that our data was accurate, precise, and overall reliable at the manufacturer's claimed performance range of 70 to 100%. We also found that at oxygen saturation ranges above 70%, pulse oximetry was accurate, precise, and overall reliable at this attachment site. However, below 70%, pulse oximetry was inaccurate and imprecise, but this is a common limitation that is found in most of these pulse oximetry devices for all species, including humans. We have shown that pulse oximetry can be used as a reliable method to monitor blood oxygen levels in immobilized white rhinoceros. We have also shown that it is important to place the probe at the right attachment site. Therefore, the palm-set pulse oximeter with a transflectant probe placed under the third eyelid works very well and gives accurate and precise readings. But it is important to note that at oxygen saturations below 70%, it is advised that you use a core oximeter to get reliable readings. Thank you so much for listening. I would like to thank the University of Pretoria Faculty of Veterinary Science, Cornell University, the NRF, and the Sava Wildlife Group for the funding. I would also like to thank Ascendis Health and Chiron for loaning me the machines that were used for my PhD. I would also like to thank my supervisors, Prof. Leith Meyer and Dr. Ned Snelling. And lastly, I would like to thank Dr. Peter Bass and the SENPAX team for the help and assistance during my PhD. Thank you so much.
Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about my research project, the influence of 3 diets on the lipid and hormone profile in a population of healthy cats. The cat is an obligate carnivore adapted to a diet high in protein and low in carbohydrates. Older research postulated that it was high carbohydrate diets that increased the risk of feline obesity. However, more recent literature has failed to show these findings. Importantly, obesity is still a risk factor for diabetes mellitus in cats, and dietary therapy for diabetics should focus on reducing postprandial hypoglycemia, minimizing fluctuations in glucose, and increasing muscle mass. And the current evidence base would suggest that a diet high in protein and low in carbohydrate is still desirable and beneficial for a diabetic cat. However, there is still not much literature as to whether this high protein diet would be advantageous to the healthy cat. There has been conflicting evidence regarding the influence of carbohydrates and fats on the glycemic response in cats. While older research basically demonstrated that it was carbohydrates that have a negative effect on glycemic response, we now are starting to see that high-fat diets in comparison to high-carbohydrate diets actually have a diminishing effect on B-cell function. And while older research actually showed that the fiber actually improved glycemic control, this has not been replicated in recent findings. The issue with a lot of these studies, especially nutritional-based studies on the glycemic response in cats, they differ in population size, study design, the type of diets used, how long they're on these particular diets, and it basically just makes comparison amongst these studies actually quite difficult. The influence of diet, in particular fat, on the lipid profile has also shown conflicting findings. While high-fat diets do increase triglyceride concentrations in cats, high-protein and low-carbohydrate diets, some have shown it does and some have shown it doesn't. And high-fat diets have shown to increase cholesterol concentrations in some studies, but not in others. My co-author Eric Zini demonstrated that diabetic cats with hypercholesterolemia and increased cholesterol concentrations are 65% less likely to achieve diabetic remission. And more recent literature has shown that high protein diets traditionally given to the diabetic cat, in this study given to lean, overweight, and diabetic cat, it actually resulted in elevated cholesterol concentrations. The aim of my study was to determine the influence of high protein and high carbohydrate diets on serum concentrations of cholesterol, triglycerides, and fructosamine. This was a randomized crossover clinical trial with 40 cats recruited from an animal shelter in Johannesburg and 35 completing the study. All of the cats were microchipped to allow for ease of identification. Weekly clinical examinations, body condition scores, weight and environmental temperatures were performed, and all of the cats were fed ad lib. My inclusion criteria were age over 1 year, no renal, liver, cardiac disease, diabetes mellitus, or hyperthyroidism. They had to be FIV and FeLV negative, no prior serious medical history or on any medical treatment. They had to accept restrained venipuncture in all diets, which doesn't matter who you are, bleeding 40 cats is a lot of fun. No prior history of chronic vomiting or diarrhea, and they had to have a known birth date with a complete vaccination record. Prior to enrollment, cats were fed a baseline diet, which was a commercial diet given to them by the shelter. Thereafter, they underwent a health screen where full clinical examinations were performed, a full serum biochemistry, CBC, triglycerides, cholesterol, fructosamine, total T4, as well as an FIV-FeLV snap test. They then underwent a transition period of 7 days onto either the high protein or high carbohydrate diet after being randomized into one of those diets. Thereafter, they will then transition for 7 days onto the washout diet for 4 weeks. And thereafter, they were then transitioned on for another 7 days onto the other crossover diet, which they would then remain on for 4 weeks. And blood samples were taken after the 4-week high protein, high carbohydrate, and washout diet. These are the different diets used expressed on a dry matter basis. The fat content of the high protein and washout diet was nearly equal, but more than double than that of the high carbohydrate diet, while the washout diet had the highest fiber, followed by the high protein and high carbohydrate diets. Cats on the high protein diet had significantly elevated serum cholesterol concentrations in comparison to the baseline diet, while cats on the high carbohydrate diet had significantly lower serum cholesterol concentrations in comparison to the baseline diet. And while not demonstrated here, a multivariable association showed that the increase in cholesterol was significantly more pronounced in cats with a body condition score of less than or equal to 5. Similarly, cats on a high protein diet had significantly elevated serum triglyceride cholesterol concentrations, and on a multivariable association, this increase was more pronounced in cats with a body condition score of less than or equal to 5. Cats on a high protein diet had significantly lower fructosamine values in comparison to the baseline diet. In diabetic cats, hypercholesterolemia reduces the chance of remission by almost 65%. While it may play an important role in the pathogenesis of diabetes, its role in healthy cats are still debatable. Prior research has demonstrated that cats, lean, overweight, and diabetic cats fed a high-protein, low-carbohydrate diet have resulted in elevated cholesterol concentrations amongst all three groups. In my study, the high-protein diet resulted in higher serum cholesterol concentrations in comparison to the other diets. And in my study, cats fed the high-protein diet had elevated median cholesterol amongst all three body condition score groups. Interestingly, the overweight cats on the high-protein diet did not have as much of an increase in cholesterol concentrations. The mechanism through which ingested protein results in an upregulation of cholesterol warrants further investigation. Insoluble fiber has been positively associated with cholesterol concentrations in overweight cats, and it has been speculated that it alters lipoprotein production at the level of the liver. And while I previously mentioned the discrepancies of fat on the influence on cholesterol concentrations, in my study, my high-protein diet, which was a much higher fiber and nearly twice the fat content as the carbohydrate diet, the high-protein diet resulted in significantly elevated cholesterol concentrations, while the high-carbohydrate diet, with its low fiber and low fat, resulted in significantly lower cholesterol concentrations. And while I previously touched on the conflicting evidence on the influence of diet on triglycerides, the high-protein diet resulted in increased triglyceride concentrations in healthy cats, However, the triglycerides and cholesterol decreased in overweight cats when on the high-protein diet. And the differences here may potentially be related to the differences in my study to previous study designs. As I previously mentioned, that most studies assessing the glycemic response have mainly focused on diabetic cats, and very few studies have involved healthy cats. In my study, cats on the high carbohydrate diet had the highest median fructosamine concentrations, while cats on the high protein diet had the lowest median fructosamine concentrations in comparison to the other diets. In addition to this, I briefly touched on that some studies have shown an influence of fiber on glycemic response where others haven't. It has been speculated that fiber may not be as important in cats, largely because they continue with gluconeogenesis from protein, which may explain why it potentially is less effective in the species. But in my study, my high protein diet, which is high in protein, fiber, and fat, but low in carbohydrate diets, actually showed decreased glucose concentrations. There were a few limitations to my study. None of the cats were fed according to their individual requirements. All cats were fed ad lib, and this has been regarded as a risk factor for obesity, and this may have predisposed them to gain weight. The amount that each cat fed on each food was not recorded, and then it is possible that certain cats actually preferred one type of food to another. And a wet food was only used for the high protein diet, largely because I chose the high protein diabetic food, and both the dry and the wet food would traditionally be given in a clinical setting. In addition to this, the wet food had nearly exactly the same fat, protein, and carbohydrate content as the dry food. In conclusion, diets high in protein but low in carbohydrates might be beneficial for short-term glucose control in healthy cats. The reduction in triglyceride and cholesterol concentrations in overweight cats on a high-protein diet is a novel result that warrants further investigation. Previous research has demonstrated that overweight cats have a higher HDL cholesterol concentration, and thus it may have been an adaptation to protect against atherosclerosis. And the increase in triglyceride and cholesterol concentrations on a high protein diet and reduction in cholesterol concentration on a high carbohydrate diet also warrants further investigation. I would like to thank Hills for sponsoring all the food, Verbac for providing all the microchips, and the Animal Anti-Cruelty League for assisting me with the research. The study was funded by the South African Veterinary Foundation, the Pathobiology theme of the faculty, and the Health and Welfare Sector Education and Training Authority. These are my references. More references. Thank you very much for listening.
Hello everyone, my name is Claire Julie Akwongo, and today I'm presenting my research on prevalence, risk factors for exposure, and socio-economic impacts of pests de petit rumino in Karenga District, Karamoja Region, Uganda. Now, PPR is a disease of mainly goats and sheep caused by the small ruminant mobile virus, and it is ranked as one of the most important transboundary livestock diseases, especially in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, and it is associated with high morbidity and mortality rates. It is estimated that 2/3 of the world's small ruminant populations is at risk of getting infected with the virus, and with an estimated annual economic loss of $2 billion, the disease threatens food security and livelihoods of over 3 million farmers globally. And it is for this reason that the World Organization for Animal Health has earmarked it for eradication by 2030. Now, our study was conducted in Karenga district that is located in the Karamoja region in northeastern Uganda. The district is inhabited by mainly the Karamojong tribe, who are pastoralists and whose livelihoods greatly depend on livestock. Now, the aim of our study was to obtain a better understanding of the epidemiological situation of PPR in Karenga district, as well as the impact of the disease on the livelihoods of small ruminant farmers. And the objectives were, one, to determine the seroprevalence of anti-SRM antibodies in goats and sheep in Karenga district using C-ELISA, and to establish the risk factors associated with the occurrence and spread of the disease in Karenga district, as well as to determine the socio-economic impact of PPR among communities in Karenga using participatory epidemiology. Now, for the determination of prevalence, 22 crowds were selected from all 7 sub-counties in Karenga district randomly, and from each crowd, between 28 to 31 goats and sheep were selected using a systematic random approach. And in total, 684 small ruminants were selected for blood sampling, and the resultant serum was analyzed by C-ELISA from IDVET. For the determination of the socio-economic impact, we employed participatory epidemiology. Groups of 50 individual small ruminant farmers were interviewed, as well as 15 key informants were interviewed to give us a perspective on the PPR situation in the district. And then visual tools like simple ranking, pairwise ranking, proportional piling for morbidity and mortality, and disease impact matrix scoring were applied in focus group discussions in 22 groups of pastoralists and herders. Now, going on to the results, out of 684 small ruminants examined during the study, 24.3% showed observable clinical signs suggestive of PPR, and the most common signs observed included oral lesions, ocular discharges, mucopurulent nasal discharges, and diarrhea. And the highest proportion of animals that showed clinical signs were from Kapedo, followed by Kawalakol and Sangar sub-county. Now, out of the 684 serum samples analyzed, 334 turned out positive for small ruminant morbillivirus, yielding an apparent prevalence of 48.8% and a true prevalence of 51.4%. And the final multivariable logistic regression identified location, animal species, and age as the risk factors for exposure to PPR in Karenga district, with the highest prevalence obtained from Kapedo sub-county, followed by Kawalakol and Sangar sub-counties. Now, interviews with individual small ruminant farmers indicated that 94% of them separated the animals by species and age group, and all of them raised their animals communally and watered them communally. All the respondents were aware of PPR, but only 6% were aware of the control mechanisms. 72% of the respondents treated their animals through trial and error, while 24% accessed the services of community animal health workers, and only 4% had access to veterinarians or paraveterinarians. They indicated that there has not been any vaccination against PPR or any other disease of small ruminants in the district for the past 3 years. Now, about small ruminant trade, 82% of the respondents engaged in trade in small ruminants to meet immediate household needs, while 18% engaged in it as a major source of income. And then marketing was done both within the locality and other locations, including other sub-counties, other districts, as well as other countries like Sudan, South Sudan and Kenya. And then the animals that were returned, that were taken for marketing and returned unsold, were introduced back to the herd with no quarantine period observed. Now, the socio-economic indicators, the socio-economic impact indicators that were listed during the focus group discussions included high morbidity, high treatment costs, high mortality rates, low marketability, reduced milk yield, low reproduction rates, loss of status in the community, increased conflicts, and the animals being unsuitable for payment of bride price and also unsuitable for rituals. Now, PPR was ranked second as the greatest cause of morbidity that ranged between 14 to 27%. It was ranked fourth as having the highest treatment cost, and the cost of treating one PPR sick animal ranged between 1.5 to 5.5 USD, which is approximately 31.2% of the price of the value of the animal. And PPR was ranked as having the highest mortality rates, ranging between 56 to 100%. And it was highlighted as resulting in low marketability of the animals, with a price reduction of between 56.3% to 61.5%. And animals that suffered from PPR were indicated to have reduced milk yield and a reduction of between 61 to 100%. Now, the challenges to disease control highlighted by the respondents included low technical capacity in the district to respond to disease outbreaks, and then lack of prioritization of disease control by the district. And then there's a break in disease reporting channel due to the understaffing of the veterinary department. And then cultural practices like raids and migrations undermined the efforts that are already in place in controlling the disease. And then there are infrastructural challenges like poor road networks, lack of quarantine facilities for PPR infected animals. Then there's poor coordination between different development partners and government, such that there was a gap in identifying the priority diseases to target for control. And then there were policy challenges that hampered the smooth flow of information between the local population and the central government. And this also resulted in delayed vaccine deliveries to the district. Now, our findings, the prevalence findings in our studies are similar to those that were identified in other areas of Karamoja. For example, Kamwesiga et al. Reported a prevalence of 51.4%, and Mulingo et al. Reported a prevalence of 57.6% in Karamoja region. But in other locations, the prevalence ranged between 1.6 to 9.5, and that was in Western Uganda and Eastern Uganda. The PPR and the anti-SRM antibodies identified in this research were due to natural infection, because our study did not sample goats and sheep that were less than 6 months old, and then none of the animals sampled was vaccinated against the disease. Now, there was higher prevalence in Kapedo, Kawalakol, and Sangar than other locations in Karenga district. This could be attributed to the frequent transboundary movement of livestock between those locations and South Sudan and other districts where PPR prevalence is high. And then the prevalence was higher in sheep than goats, and these findings are similar to those that were reported in Nigeria and Ethiopia. However, it was contrary to those that were identified in Tanzania and Kenya, where the prevalence was higher in goats than sheep. However, in all of these studies, the differences were not significant. Now, exposure to PPR ranged, exposure to PPR increased by age, and this could be attributed to the longevity of the animals in the herd, and that they had frequent exposure to the disease, as for the longer they stayed in the herd and interacted with other herds in the area through the communal grazing and watering, the more they get exposed to the virus. And now the socio-economic impacts identified in these findings are similar to those findings that were reported in Turkana and in Kenya. Now, in conclusion, the true prevalence of PPR in Karenga district was 51.4%. The risk factors for exposure were location, species, and age, and PPR was the second most important disease of small ruminants in the district. And PPR was widespread and endemic in Karenga district and directly hampers food security, livelihoods development, and reduces standard of living. Now, we recommend control measures to target multiple diseases, seeing as PPR CCPP and other diseases were also prevalent in the area, and then they should prioritize recruitment of key veterinary staff to handle disease surveillance and control, and also capacity building in disease surveillance, outbreak investigation, and reporting should be emphasized for the existing staff, and there should be improved stakeholder engagement and involvement in planning, as well as public-private partnership in disease control. Farmers need to be sensitized on PPR control and the risk factors, and then they should also be encouraged to adopt alternative livelihood initiatives to spread risks in case of disease outbreaks, especially for PPR that has very high mortality rates. Now, we would like to acknowledge the following people who assisted with the research, and that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Rufilo Bogava, and I'm currently completing my PhD at the Tropical Diseases Department. The title of my study is Unraveling the Dynamics of Toxoplasmosis in an Interface Area in Mpumalanga, South Africa. Under the supervision of Professor Luis Neves and co-supervision of Dr. Dashana Mora-Lida and Professor Pierre Doni. Toxoplasma gondii is an obligate protozoan parasite from the phylum Epicomplexa. This parasite causes an infection known as toxoplasmosis in warm-blooded animals. Approximately a third of the population is affected by this parasite worldwide. The clinical manifestations can vary from mild flu symptoms to severe conditions such as lymphadenopathy, mental disorders, encephalitis, ocular diseases, deafness, and abortions in certain species, including humans. The most common routes of transmission are through the ingestion of contaminated meat, the ingestion and inhalation of sporulated oocysts from the environment, and through vertical transmission from mother to fetus. When infected, the parasite generally doesn't cause a clinical infection, or at most a mild infection might occur, but it can become very severe, particularly in pregnant women, goats, sheep, and immunocompromised hosts. There are two types of hosts. The definitive hosts, who are from the Felidae family, that experience both the sexual and asexual cycle of the parasite, therefore are crucial for the survival of the parasite in terms of genetic recombination and variation. The second type of hosts are the intermediate hosts, who are almost all mammals and birds, and these hosts only experience an asexual cycle. How severe the clinical symptoms become during the infection has been associated to the type of strain the host is infected with. Currently, there are three main lineages found worldwide: lineages 1, 2, and 3. Strains from lineages 1 have been seen to be more virulent when compared to those from lineages 2 and 3. The current table indicates some of the prevalence studies done in South Africa, with prevalences ranging from 4 to 100%, with high prevalences seen in wild felids. Globally, there's immense information on Toxoplasma gondii, but only less than 20 publications are found in South Africa. Due to the scarcity in data in South Africa, we do not really know of its impact in the country. Globally, toxoplasmosis is known as an important zoonosis. Therefore, the current study is informative in learning the dynamics of this parasite in an interface area where human, livestock, and wildlife cohabit, and further add to the data currently present in the country. The aim of the study was to understand the epidemiology of Toxoplasma gondii at the wildlife-human-livestock interface using quantitative and qualitative parameters. The objectives were to determine the seroprevalence of T. gondii present in humans, cats, goats, chickens, rodents, impalas, kudus, warthogs, wildebeests, and zebras in Mpumalanga using a latex agglutination test. The second was to identify the T. gondii strains circulating in seropositive rodents captured from three types of habitats, namely the human dwellings, conservation areas, and agricultural pasture lands using a nested PCR. The third objective was to measure the parasite density of T. gondii in heart, brain, muscle, and tongue tissue cells of seropositive rodents. The fourth was to identify the rodent species using a multiplex PCR. And lastly, to conduct a questionnaire to investigate whether the socio-economic, environmental, and husbandry conditions in the study could play a role in the transmission of T. gondii. Two formulas were used to identify the sample sizes. The first is a general formula for prevalence studies, and the second calculates the actual sample size in finite populations. Presented are the sample sizes in the study. Unfortunately, we could not obtain our full sample sizes in humans, cats, kudus, wildebeests, and zebras impacted by availability. The project is divided into two studies. The seroprevalence study, which includes serology and questionnaires, and the second part of the study, which is the rodent study, including serology and the molecular analysis. Blood collected from cats, chickens, goats were collected from villages Ethel, Gothenburg, Klavekisa, and Uta. The human serum samples were from the NICD, who are collecting blood samples investigating acute febrile infections at the Kluvukani Healthcare Center. The wildlife serum samples were from the Sand Park Biobank, collected from nature reserves in Mpumalanga. After collection, the blood was processed for serum and all samples were tested. The questionnaires were conducted per household, also from the 4 villages mentioned above. The questionnaires were for household owners 18 years and older and should have signed a written consent to be a participant. Rodents were captured in the human dwellings in Ethel, Gothenburg, Klavekisa, and Uta in the Mnisi community, including their pasture lands. And lastly, rodents were also captured in the Manyaneti Nature Reserve. The tomahawk and Sherman traps were used for the capturing, and a mixture of peanut butter and oats was used as bait. Subsequent to capturing, rodents were then euthanized with isoflurane. Blood was then collected from the heart and processed for serum for serological testing with the latex agglutination test and for dissections for the molecular analysis. The statistical analysis included the logistic regression model used for the questionnaires and prevalences, the descriptive statistics for nominal data obtained from the rodent strains and species found, and the prevalence is presented as percentages. The negative binomial distribution was for the discrete count data obtained from the infection densities, and a confidence interval of 95% with a marginal error of 5% was employed. The seroprevalence determined in humans was 9%. In cats, no anti-T. gondii antibodies were detected. In chickens, 5%, and lastly in goats, 11%. A high positive prevalence was detected in Ethel, in chickens at 17%, and in Uta, in goats at 16%. The overall seroprevalence in rodents was 18%. The highest Prevalence was detected in Ethel at 24%, followed by Clavicisa and the Manyaleti Nature Reserve, both at 20% in the different locations. This graph represents the seroprevalence detected in the different species. Although the highest prevalence was detected in the Mastomys species at 40%, the Rater species was statistically significant at 30%. Presented are the prevalences in the wildlife species. The seroprevalence in wild dogs was 50%, in impala was 5%, in kudu was 7%, in zebra 9%, in wildebeests 21%, and in warthogs 14%. The current table represents a summary of the questions asked for the household owners and the data obtained. 75% of the members were female, 98% had no knowledge or have not heard of toxoplasmosis, 36% of the members were pet owners, 91% of the pets are free roaming, 83% of the members said they would throw or bury their pets in the bush when or if an accidental death occurs, and 63% of the members are farmers. 97% of the members practice slaughtering, 83% of the members slaughter their livestock inside the yard, which can lead to contamination. All members have access to water, but 61% of the members have to fetch water at main boreholes and taps, which is also a source of contamination by oocysts. And lastly, 82% cook their meat well done, which reduces becoming infected. In conclusion, a low prevalence of T. gondii is detected in humans, livestock, and domestic cats. This could be a result of the low cat population in the area, which impacted the sample size in the current study as well, and the possible increase in the awareness of hygienic practices. A low prevalence was also detected in wildlife species, in herbivores, and an omnivore. A slightly higher prevalence in wildebeest, which could be impacted by the small sample size. With the questionnaire results, the members have no knowledge of toxoplasmosis. Most of the household owners have informal farms, so therefore interact with animals regularly. The females are mostly the ones that take care of the animals in the yard. The community members have to fetch water at main boreholes and taps, which can result in an easy contamination of oocysts. What is still outstanding in the study is completing the molecular work for the rodent study and the statistical analysis. I would like to acknowledge the university and the ITM-FA4 for our funding, Dr. Veronique Dermal for the data analysis, the Hunter Wisen Wildlife Research Station, the environmental monitors from the Kluvukani Veterinary Clinic, the NICD, Sandparks, and MTPA for our sampling. These are my references. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to share my work. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. Today I will be presenting an anesthetic comparison study looking at the effects that medetomidine, ketamine, and medetomidine xylitol has on the cardiovascular parameters in chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are considered an endangered species, with their numbers still declining due to habitat loss, disease, and conflict with humans. This often leads to a large number of chimpanzees ending up in captivity, where they would require anesthesia for a variety of reasons. These reasons may include health assessments, surgical procedures, dental work, disease screening, and translocations. Inducing anesthesia in chimpanzees is particularly challenging due to their physical strength, agility, and intelligence, which could also contribute to severe human injuries. This creates the need for anesthetic protocols that are effective and safe for both animals and their caregivers, while having minimal impact on the physiological parameters. The aim of the study was to specifically look at the effects that medetomidine and ketamine and medetomidine xylitol has on the cardiovascular and respiratory systems to assess the effectiveness of their use in chimpanzees. The 22 chimpanzees included into the study were all housed at the Jane Goodall Institute South Africa, and data was collected during the annual health assessment of these individuals. Each individual received a pre-medication dose of midazolam approximately 30 minutes before anesthetic agents were administered to assist in alleviating the stress that may be associated with anesthetic induction. Each individual then received either a combination of medetomidine at 0.03 milligrams per kilogram and xylitol at 1.5 milligrams per kilogram, or a combination of medetomidine at 0.05 milligrams per kilogram and ketamine at 5 milligrams per kilogram. All doses administered was estimated based on the weights obtained from previous health assessments and was administered via hand injection. Anesthesia was further maintained by administering an intravenous ketamine dose of 1.5 milligrams per kilogram at approximately 20 minutes after the individual was approached. After the administration of anesthetic agents, the time until the first signs of sedation and the time to recumbency was observed and recorded. The individual was approached as soon as it was evident that the individual was unresponsive to any external stimuli and moved to the on-site clinic where individuals were intubated after accurate weights were obtained. The quality of the induction and the ease of intubation was subjectively scored at this point. Cardiovascular and respiratory parameters, including heart rate, respiratory rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, and end-tidal CO2, as well as rectal temperature, were recorded every 5 minutes, starting approximately 10 minutes after the individual was approached. Additionally, a single arterial blood sample was collected at approximately 20 minutes of monitoring, and using a portable gas analyzer, these samples were immediately analyzed to obtain blood gas values. After the completion of all procedures, the individual was returned to the night rooms and placed in lateral recumbency. Atipamezole was administered at 5 times the initial medetomidine dose to partially reverse the anesthetic effect. Recovery was monitored and the individual was extubated once the swallow reflex has returned, after which monitoring was continued from the outside of the enclosure. The time and the quality of recovery was observed and recorded. Our findings indicated that the overall induction time was longer when anesthesia was induced with the medetomidine-ketamine combination. It was also noted that the first signs of sedation was observed faster when anesthesia was induced with the medetomidine-ketamine combination, but the period between individuals showing signs of sedation and becoming recumbent was shorter when anesthesia was induced with the medetomidine-xylitol combination. Analysis of cardiovascular parameters indicated that heart rate was significantly higher when anesthesia was induced with the medetomidine-ketamine combination, which may be associated with the stimulatory effect that ketamine has on the cardiovascular system. Although medetomidine-ketamine produced an overall higher heart rate, the observed heart rate for both protocols were below the ranges described as normal for chimpanzees, indicating that bradycardia may have occurred. On the other hand, the systolic, diastolic, and mean arterial blood pressure were all found to be significantly higher when anesthesia was induced with the medetomidine-xylitol combination. Blood pressure characteristics for both anesthetic protocols were elevated soon after the individuals were approached, but decreased over time and remained within the normal ranges described for chimpanzees. A slight increase in blood pressure was observed in the medetomidine-ketamine group around the time ketamine was administered for anesthetic maintenance. The vasoconstriction properties of medetomidine will produce a biphasic blood pressure response that is characterized by an initial high blood pressure that is followed by a long period of hypo or normotension, similar to what was observed in this study. Administering anesthetic agents will have an effect on the respiratory system to some degree. Our results indicated that both respiratory rate and end-tidal carbon dioxide was higher when anesthesia was induced with a medetomidine-xylitol combination. Our data also indicated that respiratory rate was slightly higher than what is described as normal for chimpanzees, while the observed end-tidal CO2 fell within normal ranges. Furthermore, peripheral oxygen saturation, the partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide, as well as the AA gradient, were all significantly higher when anesthesia was induced with a medetomidine-ketamine combination. The lower than normal oxygen saturation and partial pressure of oxygen indicated that some degree of hypoxemia occurred in both anesthetic protocols. But it seems that the hypoxemia is more severe when anesthesia is induced with a medetomidine-xylitol combination. As hypoxemia is a common respiratory complication in individuals under anesthesia, these parameters should be closely monitored. As the partial pressure of carbon dioxide for both protocols in this study fell within the normal ranges described for chimpanzees, it may indicate that the observed hypoxemia did not occur due to hyperventilation, but rather due to other intrinsic factors. The overall recovery was found to be smooth and uneventful for both anesthetic protocols. However, the observed recovery time was longer when anesthesia was induced with a medetomidine-ketamine combination. Generally, xylitol and xylitol combinations are associated with the longer recovery periods, but the prolonged recovery period observed in the medetomidine-ketamine group in this study could be related to the extended period of anesthesia that was required to conduct procedures. In conclusion, both anesthetic protocols provided safe and effective anesthesia for chimpanzees. Anesthesia could be rapidly induced and provided good anesthetic depth. Even though recovery was slightly prolonged, recovery for both protocols was smooth. Our results indicated that both anesthetic protocols did have an effect on the cardiovascular and respiratory system to some degree, with the respiratory system being more severely affected when anesthesia was induced with the medetomidine-xylitol combination. That concludes this presentation. Thank you for listening.
Well, congratulations. They were 5 excellent talks, I'm sure. I'm sure you'll all agree with me that they were 5 excellent talks that we've had there from our postgraduate students. So we do have a few questions in the Q&A section, and so I'll just go through them. So Prof. Joseph, he asked a question to Chad, and the question was, when you say decrease glucose concentrations, how significantly are they compared with normal ranges? But Chad has already diligently responded to that, and he mentioned that the fructosamine concentrations were significantly decreased on a high protein diet when compared to the baseline diet. However, they were still within normal ranges. And we had a question from Ash Donaldson, who also asked a question to Chad. Was there a difference in body weight gain between the two groups? They would be the high carbohydrate and the high protein groups. And Chad responded, animals on the high protein diet and males gained more weight, which, yeah, is interesting because, Chad, I'm not sure if you are able to come in here. I know some work by Steve Simpson during the 90s. He fed high carbohydrate diets and high protein diets to rodents. And what he found, or his group found, was that the high carbohydrate diets, as well as the high protein diets, they both led to obesity in rodents. But the rodents that were fed a balanced diet actually didn't gain weight. And the hypothesis that they came up with was that these rodents, the ones that were fed high protein, they kept eating and eating and eating to try and find the carbohydrate that didn't exist in their diet. And conversely, with a high carbohydrate diet, they kept eating and eating and eating to try and find the protein that was lacking in their diet. And that led to obesity in those two groups. I wonder, Chad, maybe you've come across those early studies?
Yeah, so can you hear me there?
Yep, perfect.
Cool. So, I mean, a lot of the stuff when it comes to cats in this, there's a lot of conflicting evidence. So, in particular, your more older research that looked at this, it was mainly focused that it was your high carbohydrate diets that actually resulted in obesity amongst cats. But as the literature and as research started to change with time, more recent literature has actually shown it's not necessarily the type of diet that is actually going to be your predisposing factor. It's actually the amount of the food that they eat with these cats, and exactly that it is balanced. But I think that the take-home message with a lot of the stuff is we thought that carbohydrate diets with cats were just these terrible things, and it's not quite the case as it would seem as we're starting to evolve our research. So a lot of conflicting findings with the stuff. So it's more about how you balance these diets, and there are also other predisposing factors, whether they're indoor confinement and neutering and males, etc., also play a really large role amongst cats. I hope that answers that question.
Sure. Thank you very much, Chad. Okay, Prof. Barney, I noticed that you asked a question for Refiwe about why would drinking or getting water from a borehole increase the risk of contamination with Toxoplasma oocysts. But Refiwe, unfortunately, is having connection problems. So you will be able to forward that message into the chat, because she is able to access the chats, but she isn't able to join the session backstage. Okay, so we have another question from Dr. Dashana. Oh, this one is also to Refiwe, so just to repeat, please, Darshana, if you could send that question into the chats, and Refiwe will be able to answer that. Your question was, in every village there is a central borehole supplying water to the communities, or maybe you're answering the question for Prof. Barney. Okay, okay, thank you, Darshana. Okay, and so I also had a question. It was actually to Chantel. Well, it was really a comment, and that is that, you know, a lot of the veterinary equipment that is used has been developed for humans, and especially those that relate to blood gas analysis. And as such, the measurements aren't measured directly by the equipment. They actually calculated based on human algorithms, and that can lead to erroneous values. But it occurred to me that in chimps, this is probably the best species that you could possibly choose in order to reliably obtain blood gas values from, because chimps have such a similar relative body mass to humans, which accounts for the largest source of variation or potential error. And also they're very closely phylogenetically related to humans. So I don't know, Chantel, if you're there, maybe you can comment on, or just quickly comment on, yeah, how confident you are in the values returned from the instruments that you're using on these chimps.
Hi, Ned. Can you hear me now?
Perfect. We can hear you. Are you there, Chantal? Okay, I think we've lost you, Chantal. You're on mute at the moment. Nope. Okay, I think in that case, if we don't have any more questions, Leith has just asked a question for Chantal. What intrinsic factors do you think could have caused hypoxemia in the chimps, considering that hypoventilation wasn't the cause? Okay, Leith, I think if Chantal is unable to come online, then that might be a question for the chats. And Chad has also come back to me. Research has also shown that cats limit intake with carbohydrates. Okay, well, I think in that case, because we only had a very short break, maybe we can finish now, and maybe we can all join in congratulating our postgraduate students on their excellent talks.
Okay, thank you very much to everybody for that. So we now have a short break. We will convene again at 12:45 for another postgrad speed session. Please remember to visit the booths of our exhibitors and to interact with their representatives. See you later.